The Last Hope: Rise of the Cyborgs. Chapter 1. Desperate measures. The spaceship hurtled through the black void of space, its engines burning bright as it raced towards a distant planet. Captain Jack Reynolds sat in the cockpit, his hands gripping the controls tightly, his eyes fixed on the viewscreen ahead. He was a seasoned spacer, with over 10 years of experience under his belt, but even he was feeling the tension mounting in his chest as they approached their destination. They were on a desperate mission, one that could mean life or death for the entire human race. A massive asteroid was hurtling through space towards Earth, and if it struck, it would mean the end of civilization as we knew it. The only hope was to intercept the asteroid and destroy it before it could reach the planet. But time was running out, and the mission was a long shot at best. The odds were against them, and they had few resources to work with. Reynolds turned to his crew. There were 4 of them in total: Elena, the ship's engineer; David, the weapons expert; James, the navigator, and Reynolds second in command; and finally, Sarah, the doctor. They were all professionals, hand-picked for this mission for their skills and experience. But even so, they were facing odds that would make even the most experienced spacer's blood run cold. "All right, team," Reynolds began, addressing his crew. "You all know why we're here. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we've got. We need to intercept that asteroid and destroy it before it reaches Earth. We've got a few tricks up our sleeve, but we're going to have to pull out all the stops for this one. Elena, bring up the asteroid's coordinates. David, get the weapon systems online. James, plot us a course. And Sarah, make sure everyone's healthy and ready to go. We've got a lot of work to do, and not much time to do it in." The crew nodded, getting to work immediately. Reynolds watched them for a moment, feeling a sense of pride and camaraderie in his team. They were risking everything for a chance to save their world. It was the kind of courage that made him proud to be a spacer. As the ship approached the asteroid, they could see its massive bulk looming ahead, like a giant beast waiting to swallow them whole. Reynolds felt a chill run through his spine, but he forced himself to stay focused. They had one shot at this, and they couldn't afford any mistakes. "All right, here we go," he said, his voice calm but firm. "David, fire the lasers on my mark. Elena, engage the thrusters as soon as I give the signal. James, steer us clear of any debris. And Sarah, be ready to treat any injuries we might sustain." The crew nodded again, their eyes fixed on their instruments as they waited for Reynolds' signal. It was a moment of tense silence, broken only by the whir of the ship's engines and the beep of the instruments. Then, finally, Reynolds raised his hand. "Now!" The ship lurched forward, hurtling towards the asteroid at breakneck speed. The lasers fired, striking the asteroid with a burst of blinding light. The engines roared, pushing the ship forward. James deftly piloted the ship through a cloud of debris, while Sarah stood by, ready to treat any injuries. It was a harrowing experience, but somehow they made it through. The asteroid shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, its remains scattering off into space. Reynolds let out a breath he didn't even know he was holding as he realized they had succeeded. "We did it!" he exclaimed, feeling a wave of joy and relief wash over him. "We actually did it. The crew cheered, their faces glowing with triumph. For a moment, all of Earth's worries seemed to fade away, replaced by a sense of hope and triumph. But it was short-lived. As they turned to head back to Earth, the ship suddenly shook violently. The view screen cracked, and alarms blared. "What's happening?" Reynolds shouted, frantically trying to regain control of the ship. "I don't know," Elena exclaimed, her face etched with concern as she worked on the engine. "Something's gone wrong with the core. We're losing power." Reynolds swore under his breath, feeling his heart sink. They had succeeded in their mission, but now it seemed they were facing a new danger. One that could mean the end of not just their mission, but their lives. Chapter 2. Sabotage. Reynolds could hardly believe his ears as he heard Elena's words. Losing power was the last problem they needed. Elena kept working on the engine, trying her best to restore power to the ship while David and James tried their best to detect any other issues that could put them in harm's way. "Come on, Elena, you can fix this," Reynolds muttered under his breath, trying to encourage her. "I think I can get it back online, Captain," Elena replied, sweat pouring down her forehead. "But it might take a minute or two." "We don't have a minute or two, Elena," Reynolds said sharply, feeling the tension in the air thicken. "We need to get moving, now." A red light started blinking on the console as David shouted, "Captain, we have a breach in the fuel line. It's been sabotaged." Reynolds didn't even pause to think as he issued the orders. "Seal the fuel line. James, can you pinpoint the source of the breach?" James nodded, frantically surveying his instruments. "I can try, but it could take some time. We don't have visual on it yet." "Get on it, James." "Elena, any progress?" "I'm almost there, Captain," Elena grunted, her fingers dancing over the console. "Just a few more seconds." "Keep at it," Reynolds shouted. "David, get on the comms and contact Earth. We need backup, now." He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to keep the situation under control. Whoever had sabotaged the ship, they were incredibly skilled, and they could strike again at any moment. They needed to get out of danger and back to Earth, fast. Suddenly, another alarm blared through the ship, and the whole craft shook as if hit by a massive force. Reynolds' heart nearly stopped as he realized what it was. "James! An asteroid field. How close are we to it?" James's face turned pale as he examined the map. "We're right in the middle of it, Captain. It was just enough to send us off course." Reynolds cursed again, his hands gripping the controls tightly. They were running out of time, and the danger was mounting. They had to act fast. "We need to get out of here, James," he said, his voice urgent. "Find us a way out, and get us moving." James nodded and worked quickly, his fingers flying over the console as he tried to get the ship back on course. Meanwhile, Elena finally managed to restore power to the engines, and the ship lurched forward once again, heading towards a small gap in the asteroid field. Reynolds breathed a momentary sigh of relief as they passed through the gap unscathed, but then a series of missiles shot up from the asteroids, heading straight for the ship. "Missiles incoming!" David shouted, fear in his voice. "Deploy the countermeasures," Reynolds barked, his hands dancing over the console as he tried to evade the incoming missiles. Just as they were about to be hit, the ship suddenly banked to the left, avoiding the missiles by a hair's breadth. Reynolds could hardly believe his luck as he pulled the ship back onto a stable course. "James, you're a genius," he muttered, feeling a sense of gratitude and relief wash over him. But even as he spoke, he knew there was no time to rest. They still didn't know who had sabotaged the ship, or what other dangers awaited them on their journey back to Earth. The mission was far from over, and it was becoming increasingly clear that they couldn't trust anyone, not even their own crew. Reynolds gritted his teeth, feeling his resolve harden. They were going to make it through this, come hell or high water. He just hoped that the crew was up to the task. Chapter 3. Betrayal. The crew of the spaceship had been through adversity before, but nothing had prepared them for what came next. As they continued their journey back to Earth, Reynolds couldn't shake the sense that something was off. He had a nagging feeling that they were being watched, followed. He tried to push the thought aside, focus on the task at hand, but it kept nagging at him, like a warning that he couldn't ignore. Then, without warning, the ship's engines suddenly cut out. The power that Elena had been working so hard to fix disappeared. "What's happening?" Reynolds shouted, trying to regain control of the ship. "I don't know, Captain," Elena said, her voice filled with frustration. "I thought I had it fixed." "David, James, what's going on?" Reynolds demanded. David shook his head. "I don't know, Captain. There's no obvious signs of sabotage." James looked up from his console, a look of concern on his face. "Captain, we're being hailed." Reynolds frowned, surprised. On screen, the view screen blinked to life, and a figure appeared on it. Reynolds' stomach dropped as he recognized him, Brian, one of their crew members. "Bree?" Reynolds started, but he was cut off by Brian's sharp voice. "Captain, I'm sorry. I have to do this," Brian said, his voice tight with emotion. "I can't let you continue with the mission." "What are you talking about?" Reynolds demanded, his voice rising with anger. "Brian, this is insane." "I have my orders," Brian said flatly. "And I can't let you jeopardize them." The image flickered, and then suddenly cut off. The crew was left staring at a blank screen, their hearts racing with fear and confusion. Suddenly, the ship shook violently, and the view screen flickered back on, showing a group of unknown ships surrounding them. "Captain!" Elena screamed. "We're being boarded." The crew sprang into action, grabbing their weapons and rushing to the airlocks to defend the ship. But they were too late. The enemy got to them first. Reynolds was locked in a fierce battle, fighting tooth and nail against a group of masked assailants. He could hear his crew shouting, fighting for their lives, but he couldn't get to them. The enemy had taken control of the ship, and they were outnumbered and outgunned. Finally, Reynolds fell to the ground, his head spinning with pain. He saw a figure looming over him, and he braced himself for the worst. But then something unexpected happened. The figure removed his mask, and Reynolds recognized him. It was Brian. "Captain, I had to do it," Brian said, his eyes pleading. "I had no choice." "The mission? What is the mission?" Reynolds spat, his blood boiling with anger. "What the hell is going on?" Brian hesitated, then spoke, his voice low and urgent. "Captain, there's no time to explain. You have to trust me. We're all in danger. Earth is in danger." Reynolds struggled to sit up, his head still spinning. But he knew that Brian was telling the truth. They had all known that the mission was a long shot, that the odds were against them. They had known that they were risking everything. But they had never expected to face such treachery from within their own team. "All right," Reynolds muttered, still feeling the anger and betrayal simmering in his chest. "Whatever it is, we're in this together. But we need a plan. We're outnumbered, outgunned. We can't just fight our way out of this." Brian nodded, his eyes fierce with determination. "I have a plan. A way out. But we have to act fast. The fate of the world depends on it." Chapter 4. The Awakening. The crew had no choice but to trust Brian. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and they had no idea what kind of backup the enemy had waiting in the wings. They had to move fast if they wanted to survive. Brian led the crew through the ship, moving stealthily through the dark corridors. Along the way, they encountered a few enemy fighters, but they managed to take them out without alerting anyone else. Finally, they reached the ship's control room. Brian quickly got to work on the console, his fingers flying over the keys as he tried to bypass the security. "We're in," he exclaimed, after a few tense moments. "I've set up a diversion. It should keep them off our backs for a while." Reynolds nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The enemy was still outnumbering them, but they now had a chance to fight back. "What's the plan?" Reynolds asked Brian. "We need to get to the core," Brian said, his voice low and urgent. "They're using it to power their weapons. If we can disable it, we can level the playing field." Reynolds nodded, knowing that Brian was a smart guy. But he also knew that the enemy wouldn't give up their weapons without a fight. They needed a clear plan, something that would give them an advantage. "We need to split up," Reynolds said, his voice firm. "David, you take Elena and head to the weapons bay. James and Sarah, you come with me. We're going for the core." The crew nodded, their faces serious but determined. They had been through a lot already, but they had no intention of giving up now. The next few moments were a blur of action. Reynolds and his team rushed through the ship, shooting down anyone who got in their way. They encountered more resistance than anticipated, but they pressed on, their eyes fixed firmly on their goal. Finally, they reached the core. It was a massive, pulsating machine at the heart of the ship, its energy flowing outwards in waves. Reynolds hesitated for a moment, looking at the flashing lights and intricate machinery. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Reynolds took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. He had been in tough situations before, but this was different. This was the ultimate test. "We have to overload it," he said, his voice steady. "If we can push it to its limits, it'll explode. That should take out the entire ship." James nodded, understanding immediately. "But we need to do it fast. There are more enemy fighters on their way." Reynolds didn't hesitate. He started manipulating the controls, his fingers moving deftly over the console as he worked to push the core to its limits. Sarah and James guarded him, their weapons at the ready, their ears pricked for any signs of danger. Finally, the core started to shake, its energy spiking wildly. Reynolds knew that they only had seconds before the whole thing exploded. "Get out!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "Get out now!" The crew started running, their feet pounding through the corridors. Reynolds lingered behind for just a moment, watching as the core glowed brighter and brighter. Then, suddenly, it exploded. The ship shook violently as the energy of the core rippled outwards, tearing through the ship like a storm. Reynolds felt himself being thrown through the air, his body slamming hard against the wall. Then, everything went black. When he came to, he was lying on the floor, his head throbbing with pain. He tried to sit up, groaning as he felt a sharp pain in his side. He looked around, dazed, trying to get his bearings. To his surprise, he saw Elena sitting beside him, looking at him with concern. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Reynolds nodded, still feeling a bit shaken. But he knew that he was lucky to be alive. "What happened?" he asked, looking around again. Elena's face darkened. "The ship's destroyed. But we're the only survivors." Reynolds felt a sense of sadness wash over him. They had come so far, faced so much, and now they had lost so much. He felt a sense of guilt, wondering if there was anything they could have done differently. But then something strange happened. He felt a sense of power surging through him, a kind of energy that he had never felt before. He sat up, feeling the wound in his side closing up, healing itself. "What the hell?" he muttered, looking at his hands in disbelief. Elena's eyes widened. "Captain, look at the sky." Reynolds followed her gaze, and he saw something that he could hardly believe. The sky above them was filled with strange, glowing energy, swirling in rainbow colors, pulsing with power. "What is that?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Elena's face was alight with wonder. "I don't know, Captain. But I think we've just activated something incredible." Chapter 5. The Escape. Reynolds and Elena stared up at the sky, watching as the pulsing energy swirled above them. They didn't know what it was, but they knew that it was powerful, that it had the ability to change everything. As they watched, they heard a distant sound, the whine of engines, growing louder with each passing moment. "We need to move," Reynolds said, his voice tense. "Those could be more enemy fighters. We have to get out of here." Elena nodded, her face set in determination. "Right. I'll grab the supplies. We can't afford to leave anything behind." They quickly gathered what they could, weapons, food, medical supplies, and made their way to the airlock. Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, followed, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. As they stepped out into the open air, they saw something that made their hearts skip a beat, a fleet of enemy ships descending upon their location. "Move!" Reynolds shouted, his voice urgent. "We have to get to cover." They sprinted forward, running towards a group of rocks that would provide cover. They heard the enemy ships opening fire, and Reynolds took a few shots in their direction, trying to keep them at bay. Finally, they reached the rocks, dropping down behind them. Reynolds took a moment to catch his breath, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. "We're surrounded," Elena said, her voice low. Reynolds nodded grimly, knowing that they were in a dire situation. They had no hope of winning a straight-up fight, not against these odds. "We need to find a way to escape," he said, his mind racing. "We can't stay here. We have to keep moving." Elena nodded. "Right. I think I have an idea. Follow me." She led the way, darting from cover to cover, dodging enemy fire as they moved. Reynolds kept watch, trying to keep the enemy at bay, feeling the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Finally, they reached a cliff face, and Elena motioned for them to stop. She pointed to a small cave, hidden at the base of the cliff. "If we can make it there, we might have a chance," she said, her voice low. Reynolds nodded, knowing that it was their best bet. They started running towards the cave, dodging enemy fire as they went. Finally, they reached the cave, diving inside just as a hail of bullets struck the rocks around them. Reynolds waited, his heart pounding in his chest, wondering if they had made it out alive. But then he heard something strange, a low humming sound, building in intensity. He looked around, trying to figure out what was happening. Then he saw it. The energy from the sky was filtering down, directly into the cave. It felt raw, powerful, pulsating with energy. "What is that?" Elena asked, her voice filled with wonder. Reynolds wasn't sure, but he knew that they didn't have much time. They couldn't stay here, not with the enemy on their trail. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice urgent. "We can't stop now." They rushed forward, running deeper into the cave. The energy pulsed around them, filling them with a sense of power and energy that they had never felt before. Finally, they emerged on the other side, into a wide valley. But they weren't alone. The enemy had caught up with them, and they were hemmed in on all sides. "What now?" Elena asked, her eyes wide. Reynolds took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm settling over him. He had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. This was a chance to change the world. "We have to harness this energy," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We can use it to fight back. To escape." The enemy ships were bearing down on them, their weapons hot and ready. But Reynolds knew that they had something that the enemy didn't, the energy from above. He closed his eyes, feeling the energy pulsing through him. He felt himself lifting off the ground, felt Elena beside him. Then, suddenly, they were flying. The enemy ships were caught off guard, surprised by the sudden burst of power. Reynolds and Elena flew through the air, dodging enemy fire as they went. They flew higher and higher, until they were above the clouds, looking down at the world below. The energy was still pulsing through them, building to a crescendo. And then, suddenly, it all stopped. Reynolds and Elena fell to the ground, shaken but triumphant. They had made it out alive, and they had something incredible to show for it. As they looked up at the sky above, they knew that the world would never be the same again. They had awoken something incredible, something that could change everything. And they were just getting started. Chapter 6. Revenge. Reynolds and Elena stood on the hillside, looking out at the world below them. They had escaped the enemy and harnessed the power of the energy from the sky, but they knew that their journey was far from over. "We need to find out who did this," Reynolds said, his voice low and urgent. Who sent those ships to attack us? Elena nodded, her face set in determination. Right. But how do we do that? We don't have any leads. Reynolds thought for a moment, then spoke. We have to start with what we know. Brian was working with them. And he betrayed us. Elena's face darkened. But how do we find him? He could be anywhere. Reynolds squinted, surveying the area around them. He spotted a small town in the distance, and an idea started to form in his mind. We start with that town, he said. We ask around. Maybe someone knows something. They made their way down the hill, moving slowly and cautiously. As they approached the town, they saw something that made their hearts skip a beat, a group of enemy soldiers, patrolling the streets. Reynolds and Elena hid behind some bushes, taking stock of the situation. They knew that they would have to be careful if they wanted to find anything out. We need to blend in, Reynolds said, his voice low. We don't want to draw attention to ourselves. They made their way into the town, moving with purpose but also trying their best to blend in. Reynolds had to admit, he was impressed by Elena's ability to play it cool, looking around and chatting with the locals like she owned the place. Finally, they found someone who seemed to know something. A shifty-looking guy in an alley, looking nervous and edgy. I don't know nothing, he said, looking away from them. Reynolds stepped forward, his voice low and intense. We know that you're working with them. We know that you have information. The man hesitated for a moment, then spoke. What do you want to know? Reynolds leaned in, his eyes fixed on the man's face. We want to know who's in charge. Who's pulling the strings? The man looked around nervously, then spoke in a low whisper. There's a man. A powerful man. He's hiding out in a bunker, somewhere in the mountains. He's the one who's behind all of this. Reynolds nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction. They finally had a lead, something to follow up on. But then something happened that they hadn't anticipated. The man reached for a weapon, trying to take them by surprise. Reynolds reacted quickly, grabbing his own weapon and firing without hesitation. They ran from the scene, their hearts racing with fear and adrenaline. They knew that they had to get out of the town, that they needed to regroup and come up with a new plan. As they fled through the streets, they heard the sound of enemy fighters warming up. They knew that they didn't have much time, that they needed to escape before it was too late. They made their way to a nearby field, scanning the area for any signs of danger. They could hear the engines approaching, growing closer with each passing moment. Suddenly, a plan formed in Reynolds' mind. He looked at Elena, nodding towards the nearby forest. Go, he said, his voice urgent. We have to split up. I'll hold them off. Elena hesitated for a moment, looking at him with concern in her eyes. But she knew that they didn't have much time. All right, she said, her voice firm. But be careful. Reynolds smiled, feeling a surge of adrenaline. He knew that this was his chance at revenge, that he could finally take down the man who had betrayed them. The enemy fighters approached, their engines whining as they prepared to attack. Reynolds took a deep breath, feeling the power of the energy from above coursing through him. Then, he charged. He moved with blinding speed, darting through the air with grace and power. He could feel the energy pulsing around him, building to a crescendo. Chapter 7. A second chance, Reynolds dodged the enemy fire, moving with incredible speed and agility. He felt the energy pulsing around him, powering him up, making him stronger and faster than ever before. He could see the enemy fighters closing in, their weapons locked and loaded. He knew that he had to move quickly, that he couldn't afford to get hit. He flew straight towards them, his hands and feet striking out with deadly precision. He felt his attacks connecting, felt the shock waves rippling outwards with each strike. The enemy fighters were caught off guard, surprised by the sudden burst of power. Reynolds felt a sense of satisfaction as he saw them falling, one by one. But then something changed. The energy from above was no longer coursing through him, and suddenly he felt weaker. He looked around, trying to figure out what was happening. That's when he saw it, a group of enemy soldiers, surrounding him from all sides. He spun around, trying to defend himself, but they were too many, and he was too weak. He felt himself falling, felt a sharp pain in his side. He saw Elena's face, looking at him with concern, and then everything went black. Reynolds woke up in a strange place, feeling groggy and disoriented. He tried to sit up, but he felt a sharp pain in his side. "Easy there," a voice said beside him. "You took quite a beating." Reynolds turned his head, seeing a woman standing beside his bed. She was beautiful, with long dark hair and piercing blue eyes. Reynolds felt a sense of familiarity, but he couldn't place her. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice dry. The woman smiled, sitting down beside him. "My name is Dr. Chen. I've been taking care of you." Reynolds looked around the room, taking in his surroundings. It was a small, clean room, with a window looking out at the mountains. "How did I get here?" he asked. Dr. Chen looked at him with concern. "You were brought here by a group of rebels. They found you left for dead on the side of a road. They said you were fighting off a group of enemy soldiers, but that they overwhelmed you." Reynolds nodded, feeling a sense of frustration. He had been so close to taking down the man who had betrayed them, and now he was back to square one. "We have to find him," he said, his voice firm. "We have to finish what we started." Dr. Chen looked at him with a hint of sadness in her eyes. "You need to rest, Captain. You're in no shape to go anywhere." Reynolds knew that she was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He had a second chance, a chance to make things right, and he didn't want to waste it. He waited until drive. Chen left the room, then quickly got dressed and headed out into the corridor. He saw a group of rebels standing nearby, talking in hushed tones. "Excuse me," he said, moving towards them. "I need your help. I need to find someone." The rebels looked at him warily, unsure of whether to trust him. But then one stepped forward, a grizzled man with a scar on his cheek. "We're all looking for the same thing," he said. "But he's not easy to find. He's always on the move, always one step ahead of us." Reynolds felt a sense of frustration welling up inside him. It seemed like he would never find the man who had betrayed him. But then something unusual happened. Dr. Chen appeared from around a corner, looking at Reynolds with a shocked expression. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice urgent. They moved to a nearby room, and Dr. Chen closed the door behind.